Obscene, surreal, ridiculous. It's fair to say that Formula 1 teams and drivers are not happy with the FIA's latest and potentially very expensive move. That's because the maximum fine that can be levied by the FIA stewards in Formula 1 has been quadrupled. Previously, it was €250,000, but now it's a cool million. Of course, the FIA can issue bigger fines. For example, the infamous $100 million fine McLaren was hit with for the 2007 spy scandal. However, that was after a World Motorsport Council hearing, which is effectively a higher court than the FIA stewards. And it's not just competitors in F1 that could be hit hard in the pocket thanks to this. The maximum in other FIA World Championships is now €750,000, while in other FIA competitions it's 500,000. The FIA's justification is that the figures have not been reviewed or amended for the last 12 years at least. And interestingly, it also says that this does not reflect the current needs of motorsport. We'll come back to the needs of motorsport shortly, but first, let's get into why everyone is so unhappy about this. George Russell went in hard on the decision, describing it as pretty ridiculous that a driver could be fined €1 million. Russell's argument was that it's not affordable for most drivers. He cited being paid a 5-figure sum when in his first season driving for Williams in 2019, but actually making a loss of 6 figures because of having to pay out for his trainer, flights, and an assistant. Russell suggested that what probably sounds like a very first world problem is likely the case for a quarter of the grid. His old friend Alex Albon shared his concerns. He argued that people overestimate what many F1 drivers are paid, particularly in the early years, and that it would be a tough fine if it put a driver into debt. He also highlighted the fact that the super license fees are hugely costly for drivers. These are calculated based on a flat fee of $16,236 plus $2,100 per point scored the previous season. Along with the entry fees for teams, that's netting just over $27 million for the FIA, with the driver super licenses contributing more than $5 million of that. Albon also suggested that a €1 million fine is effectively only targeting 3 or 4 of the most highly paid drivers, given it's not affordable for most. Lewis Hamilton also railed against the idea, despite being one of those who definitely could afford it. He argued it has to go to a good cause, saying that's the only way they'll get that million from me. Daniel Ricciardo described the prospect as scary, while Haas driver Kevin Magnussen joked, "I would disappear, never to be found again, if fined that much." Unsurprisingly, this is now on the radar for the Grand Prix Drivers Association. Russell, a GPDA director, has said it will be taking up the issue. He also questioned where the money from the fines goes, arguing the FIA has not responded to requests to explain how it's spent. Russell said, "It seems obscene to have the possibility of a €1 million fine." The F1 teams are also concerned. The World Motorsport Council approving the increase in the ceiling of fines was a bolt from the blue. As Haas team principal Gunther Steiner said when I asked him about it, it was very unexpected. Steiner also raised the question of where the money is going, arguing he would like it to go to charity. Mercedes team principal Toto Wolff said there needs to be some deterrent for grave infringements, but he also said F1 needs a reality check for raising the potential maximum fine so high. He argued that because it's a tough economic climate out in the real world, it's wrong to portray F1 as being able to issue fines of $1 million. He also suggested half of the grid wouldn't be able to pay for it. He said F1 shouldn't be playing around with numbers that seem very surreal for people watching. That is a puzzling argument to make given the vast budgets of F1 teams, and one that doesn't entirely hold water given F1 fans watch enormous sums being thrown around all season. After all, F1 isn't afraid of conspicuously spending money in all other areas, so why not fines? But it's clear Wolff is unhappy with the FIA's move, probably for other reasons related to questioning the motives for doing so. McLaren CEO Zak Brown conceded that to get a fine of that size, you're going to have to do something pretty grave, and Aston Martin team principal Mike Crack echoed Wolff's words, saying F1 should keep its feet on the ground. What's clear is that the FIA's failure to inform the teams and drivers this was being planned before it was announced has led to pushback. That said, it's inevitable they will dislike the prospect of higher fines, which, after all, would only hit them if they transgressed the rules. There are suspicions in the F1 paddock that the FIA has raised this fine ceiling as a revenue-raising scheme. It remains to be seen how much the actual fines issued will be raised by now that the limit has been increased to $1 million, but it's worth looking at the history. The FIA stewards have never actually hit the old maximum fine. The most a driver has ever been fined was the €50,000 Max Verstappen was hit with for touching the rear wing of Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes in Parc Fermé at Interlagos in 2021. As Verstappen joked, if touching a rear wing is €50,000, I would like to know what $1 million is. Lewis Hamilton was also given a €50,000 fine for crossing the track without permission in Qatar. However, half of that was suspended, so he only had to pay $25,000. The biggest team fine was the $400,000 Racing Point was fined for using illegal brake ducts in 2020. However, that was across 2 cars, therefore more than one offence. Given the FIA stewards are usually sensible with the fines, the idea that suddenly drivers and teams are going to be hit with €1 million fines left, right and centre is clearly a ridiculous one. In that regard, the teams and drivers have overreacted a little bit. However, they have done so because they weren't given advance warning this was being considered and because of suspicions that the FIA is looking for ways to bring in more money. The total fines levied in F1 in 2023 so far is actually only $112,700, which drops to below $100,000 when you take into account the fact it includes the $25,000 suspended fine Hamilton will only have to pay if he repeats a similar offence. Mercedes is the team that has been hardest hit, although $50,000 of that total was Hamilton's fine. While the FIA stewards have the power to fine more heavily, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will. However, given the FIA expressed concerns about Hamilton's track crossing fine potentially not being serious enough, teams, drivers and the watching world will be keeping a very close eye on the size of fines in future in case they do start to creep up dramatically. But fundamentally, given the amount of money washing around in F1, it's not unreasonable for the FIA to want to raise that ceiling. The question is now whether the FIA stewards will use that power wisely. So where does all of the cash go from fines? Well, there isn't a specific pot it all goes into, but it is thrown in with the rest of the FIA's revenues. And the FIA, of course, is a not-for-profit organisation. That means the money it makes is fed back into the development and operation of motorsport from grassroots up to the top level. For example, this includes the FIA Sport Grant Programme that has given over €22 million to development projects around the world. This isn't purely cash from fines, but it's the kind of thing that the fine money goes into. On top of that, the FIA invests heavily on safety research, for example, the development of the Halo. And returning to the FIA saying that the fine levels don't reflect the needs of motorsport today, it's fair to say that the costs of such programmes show the financial demands are growing. However, it's clear that once again the FIA could perhaps communicate that better to its competitors. It does do good work, but the fact there is so much suspicion about its activities proves that more could be done to ensure the teams and drivers know what it's doing with its various programmes. The fact that teams and drivers have responded so strongly to this is proof of that. There's every chance it's an overreaction, but the FIA, F1 and the teams really need to be on the same page. And given the wider political landscape with tension over the admission, or not, of the Andretti team that the FIA is welcoming and F1 itself is less happy to let in, it's just another example of the quiet battle for power going on behind the scenes in F1. The real test will come when someone is hit with a big fine, or if there's a clear pattern of the amount teams and drivers are being stung for goes up. If that's the case, you can be certain competitors will suspect the FIA is using them to make money, while the FIA will argue it's perfectly entitled, given these are only punitive fines for rules transgressions. As Zach Brown said, the best way to avoid the problem is not to do anything that warrants a fine.